Hi everyone, this week we're talking about responding to environmental injustice and climate change. I'm really thinking about where we can follow on from the questions of emotions that we've been having, how people feel about these issues and how that affects the way in which we can act, as well as how we can engage and act in more or less ways that are effective to channel that care and that concern that we have for the environment and our societies, and just general humanity into engagement and action. A lot of work in the area of climate change and environmental justice, which focuses on emotions, seeks to consider what the combination is of emotions and feelings about environmental issues and the extent to which we engage with the threat or issue and translate that into action, which can, affect change. So two of the key vectors that have been looked at in research are the extent to which people or groups of people believe that the world is changeable, so that humanity's agency, whether individuals or collectives, can have an impact on the world, or the extent to which they have deterministic views of the world. That is, they kind of assume that history will unfold the way, or I guess present time will unfold the way that it will, and that individuals and small collectives have very little to offer in changing that process. And it is known as many other things in psychology, like having an internal or external locus of control. But at least for this, a lot of the literature in social justice conceptualizes motivation to change based on our perception or efficacy to actually change. The other key vector that often is looked at in this research is the extent to which optimism or hope, and its opposite as well, so pessimism and a sense of doom, are associated with climate action. Now, in some of these models, what comes to focus is that there are actually particular combinations of these features that are most essential or predictive of for encouraging people to act, of engagement. So oftentimes people have a combination of feelings, and it's obviously only natural that we feel confused and hopeful and upset and inspired by this threat, really. But as I'm sure you can predict, some sort of sense of optimism that it is possible, that not only is the world changeable, but we can exert our influence in the world as an individual collective, but that people actually will be able to do that, is a need to first encourage people to engage and then act further. However, like I said, pessimism and emotions that are typically classed as maybe more negative are really important as well. So emotions like fear, sadness, or anger are emotions that typically get you to react and respond to something. So if we have too much optimism that everything will be fine, we might actually not act at all. We do need to kind of recognize that there is this scary reality, as well as kind of being able to understand or believe in the ability for change. This is contrasted, for example, very strongly with those who don't feel the world is changeable. And generally, what the research suggests is that a deterministic view of the world and of human history is more highly correlated with the low level of climate action, or just general other environmental action. And that's an idea that often develops from a belief that we don't have a real influence on the world, and so there is no real point of engaging or acting. And again, mentioning complexity, this idea and the associated emotions like helplessness or hopelessness are found amongst people who do still feel optimistic about the future, but are still worried, of course, about the future. So those who feel worried about the future but feel the world is not changeable kind of assume that everything is going to work out. So they are in some state of denial, even if it is not complete denial of climate change or environmental degradation. and or they think they don't really have an influence anyway. So we may as well kind of just carry on with our lives. Again, a little bit of denial and the human tendency to want to maintain that status quo, which we all do. So those who feel both worried about the future, pessimistic about the future, and that the world is not changeable often feel that we are doomed and there is just nothing that we can do about it. So there's really no point in further engagement or action. People who feel pessimistic about the future but do believe in change often feel overwhelmed by the tasks that are perceived to be ahead of us. So if they feel a really deep sense of pessimism about the future, they might feel that the change required, or that, whilst they do believe human beings do have some agency, that the extent of change required is so overwhelming. And we often find this contributing to feelings of ecological related paralysis or despair. Those with a cautious sense of optimism are, however, more likely to engage in climate-related action. So all that being said, this image does not really reflect the greater nuance, I think, of experiences and emotions that the research is beginning to show, particularly within the forms of optimism and pessimism associated with greater climate action. Certainly, a consistent finding is that those who think that the world is not changeable are very unlikely to engage in climate action. But amongst the groups that believe in the world is changeable, the research is finding that there are quite a significant blend of optimism and pessimism that is necessary for people to kind of be encouraged into action. This is somewhat part of what my PhD is working on, and I can confirm that it is very complex and still a lot is unknown. So don't worry too much if this doesn't make sense, but try and get the foundations of this concept at least. And this is just another graph showing the standard discourse people have surrounding climate change and perhaps a delay to action as well, or an encouragement to get involved and act. So Cater and Cater actually argue that in order to develop a sense of action in people, there needs to be support for, and we need to enhance their sense of developing effective well-being in engaging with pro-environmental action. So essentially, we need to give people a sense that engaging in this activity is going to be good for them and or good for other important people in their lives. The good thing is that most solutions are actually designed to benefit people, so it's not as if we're having to tell white lies. This is a genuine form of encouragement. Now, within this, when we feel a very deep sense of pessimism, they argue that it can actually strip us of our sense of effective agency. So a very deep sense of pessimism might assume perhaps, or a person with this might assume, that the job is so big, that the future looks so dark, any human action kind of pales in comparison and can ultimately not really affect real change. And what's interesting is that Higgins argues that in this view of the world, in some way, it kind of mirrors the very kind of values and assumptions in Western intellectual traditions that have driven environmental damage in the first place. In particular, Higgins points to the way in which these discourses are often underpinned by individualism. For example, denying the power of an individual by saying things like, "What is my action going to do?" is ultimately, it's a feature of individualistic cultures. It really focuses on just the person and just their individual action. But more collective worldviews tend to not argue in this same way with that same opinion, often reflecting a sense of disconnection from the work of others. So, for example, seeing themselves as an isolated social actor rather than sensing or having an intense connection with other social actors who might be working in this and related spaces for the benefit of the environment and themselves. So Higgins says that climate pessimism draws on a more Western intellectual tradition that takes a skeptical view of human capacities and the possibilities for progress. So climate pessimism tends to evoke an idea of an atomized human nature associated with capitalist modernity and seeing people as isolated and just separate individuals from the greater society. But in contrast, while some forms of very deep and individualistic pessimism have been associated with very low climate action, other kinds of pessimism have been associated with quite high levels of social action. And as we have learned, environmental and social action are pretty much the same thing. So climate change is, of course, a social issue, not just environmental. And we kind of established that in the last slide, that pessimism and certain types will actually benefit, not benefit the individual, but benefit the individual's ability to act. In particular, Cater and Cater found that something they called constructive pessimism about the future was actually correlated with a greater sense of action and willingness to be involved and act. So constructive pessimism, they feel, is a deep worry about the future. And people described to have constructive pessimism think things are absolutely headed in the wrong direction, and the forces that are heading them in that direction are incredibly powerful. But they also believe that we have that expertise, the knowledge, and at least amongst some people, the commitment to do something about it. So they can appreciate that there is a possibility to affect change. Research has found that those who anticipate a very difficult, dark future but still believe that something could be done about it were much more likely to act than other categories. Let's call it of people like, for example, people that thought things would not be that bad, kind of excusing or meaning that they really didn't need to act. And it's so interesting because those who feel even slightly more optimistic about the future didn't really feel compelled to act because they didn't see the problem as that great. And this means that the research does indicate that a certain level of pessimism is required to encourage people into action. They also found that both ecocentric and anthropocentric concerns were associated with high levels of climate action. So that is, it doesn't matter whether the reason a person feels this constructive pessimism is because they are worried about the future, which has intrinsic value, or if they're worried about people, like intergenerational justice or whatever it is. Whether they were informed by anthropocentric views, so worried about the future of human life, or more ecocentric views, like worried about the future of life just on planet Earth as a whole, both of those people can have this type of constructive pessimism, that deep worry about the future. But that's not an assumption that it can't be changed. So making this a really key variable for change. At the same time, other researchers found that not all forms of hope are equal, and that some forms of hope about the future are actually more likely to lead to climate action delay. So these forms of hope have been called denial-based hope, which is more associated with low action, and constructive hope, which is more associated with higher levels of social action. Denial-based hope for Ojala is the idea that there is hope for the future, that we don't need to worry because everything will work out. But in a way, she kind of argues that this denies some of the core factual elements that have been determined around climate change. We find that many people might feel a sense of hope about the future, but it comes out of denial or a lack of awareness of the facts around the issue of climate change, rather than a more pure, hopeful sense that there is something better coming and it just will eventuate. Now, denial will sound inherently bad, but it is something everyone does to at least an extent every day. And it's also quite a defensive thing that we do, right? So we do it because we want to protect ourselves from something. So with that understanding, we can really appreciate that most people wouldn't know that they're denying, and engaging instead with kind of comforting themselves through this presentation of hope, but not understanding that that hope is actually founded in denial, perhaps instead of the whole truth of the reality. And that is hard, I think. It is very easy to be confused and not know who to listen to or trust. So that's why I'm saying, again, denial in this context is not a bad word. Someone is not a bad person automatically if they deny part of all of this. It is a reasonable response, at least to an extent, for something that's really overwhelming and really hard to comprehend. Does this, however, completely excuse everyone who denies from further acting? I at least don't think it does. There are some scholars that do, but I don't think it does. I kind of relate it to just as therapy is meant to support but help an individual engage in change when there is a problem. We can show empathy, of course, but recognizing this defensive mechanism is perhaps inhibiting the person. But at least when it is kind of more of a collective experience, it will inhibit more collective positive change. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is you don't go to a therapist and just receive empathy for everything you do and everything you think. That is a massive part of it. That's a massive part of healing and processing. But I think to an extent, you can't just completely empathize with someone being like, I deny everything about climate change because I don't want to get involved and it's too overwhelming. There's a problem there, you know, and part of that journey would be helping them to engage and get past that, I think, at least. Back to the research. She contrasts this, with, I'm messing up all my words. She contrasts this with what she calls constructive hope. So the researchers must have known we would study both of these and made it really easy for us to remember this, because constructive pessimism is like constructive hope. So this involves people who are constructively pessimistic about the direction that we are taking, but have hope in the belief that we are social actors out there, working on these issues. And they really have a sense that they are not alone in wanting to address these issues, and that things are being done and more can be done, of course, all in a realistic but positive way, I think. I find this easy to remember because it's kind of like constructive criticism. It is realistic but designed to help the relevant case improve. So constructive hope relies on the knowledge of the experts, the actions and motivations of other people in the field, and saying we have hope because there are people who are doing a lot about this. Saying we have hope, as I'm sure you have experienced, is actually really important in all of this. Again, we are such social creatures. If we think no one else has hope because they don't express it, we will assume that we should not have hope, or it's not normal to have hope. So simply expressing hopefulness is actually an act in itself for this cause, for change. So it sounds cliche, and it is a little bit, I think, but even the tutorial, at least that I had with the Sydney class in week 9, when I asked you to think about the future, you all did really well to sit there with some discomfort, but you were also, at least again in my class, encouraged by the good news or changes that I thought were realistic, that I thought were positive. And it is not meant to kind of make you too hopeful and be an unrealistic hope that kind of demotivates you into thinking, well, then if that's the reality and that's the future, that's fine, I don't need to do anything. But it's a realistic expression of hope based on what we know, which is that important change has happened, it continues to happen, and so could keep happening, of course. One of the most interesting findings from Ajala's research as well was that whilst we often assume and look at this kind of research through the lens of will this hope make us act, her research actually showed that it also works the other way around. So people that had constructive hope were, of course, more likely to engage in climate action, but also engaging in climate action led people to have even more constructive hope. And the reason is that when people engage in collective action with others, they're connected with the community, they're doing something that's really important for us as humans, because it gives us that constructive hope where we have that sense that there are people out there who are working on issues, and we know because we are one of them and we have seen other people doing it. It does not then deny the gravity of the issue. Sometimes it actually reinforces or makes it worse because you see the effects and how much people know, and you hear stories, and sometimes it's quite upsetting or frightening. But in the community-based context, we see how people are working and making a change. And I know it's really hard in this world, and we all are so stretched for time and effort, and whatever we have left is, kind of ours. But remember, if you want to do something, I suppose, go sign up. Just go give it a go. I promise you won't lose anything from it. Even if it doesn't work out and you don't like it, you got some stories, you got some experience. But at least the research is telling us that if we even don't feel very hopeful, go sign up to something and you'll probably be inspired by it.